Good afternoon, good morning, and good afternoon again to everybody. My name is Alex Vines. I'm Director of the Africa Programme at Chatham House, and I'm delighted that we're co-hosting today with the African Union and UNDP this webinar on the long-term socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 across Africa. This meeting is fully public. It's not under the Chatham House rule. And so if you're following us, please feel free to tweet what you hear. So you can use hashtag Chatham House Africa. We are offering simultaneous French and English translation throughout, and you'll find that the interpretation function at the bottom allows you to do that. So do choose which language you prefer to listen to this discussion in. We have first a couple of keynote speakers, followed by the main presenter of the report, and then a group of panelists discussing the report's findings, followed by Q&A with you, the audience. And so if you want to ask questions, either put your questions in the Q&A or put your hand up and we will use your raise hand function, and we'll then choose to invite you to ask your question and unmute you. My apologies already in advance if we're not able to come to you because of the volume of questions. So, as I said, this is a meeting on the long-term socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 across Africa. There have been various joined-up responses of African countries to COVID-19, including in coordination of medical provision and knowledge-sharing networks, and they have underscored the continued commitment of African countries to regional collaboration and integration. The UNDP has produced a new report, which is being launched here today, called Analysing Long-Term Socio-Economic Impacts of COVID-19 Across Diverse African Continents. The speakers will reflect on the varying economic consequences of COVID-19 across Africa, including on human development indicators, economic interdependence, and the growth and resilience patterns. They will also discuss the significance of these conclusions for capacity building and long-term strategizing by African countries to the pandemic. Well, we have a fantastic group of people today who are going to talk about this. And I want to turn first of all to our keynote speakers. We have two of them. Now, they have long and distinguished careers, and I could spend half this meeting reading out their resumes, but I'm not going to do that. We're going to have those in the chat line. But I'm going to just say that we have Noura Hamlalji, who's the Deputy Regional Director of the Africa Bureau of the United Nations Development Programme speaking. Noura, thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to make your opening keynote remarks, then I will turn to our second keynote speaker and introduce him after you. Noura, it's a great pleasure to host you here today, and I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to you, and good morning. Your Excellency, Mr. Arbel Mushanga, African Union Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Dr. Alex Vines, good afternoon to you, Director of Africa Program at Chatham House, all Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues. This report today comes at a timely moment where we are still in the middle of a pandemic that has a severe impact on the socio-economic situation of Africa. While we can say that Africa has suffered less from the impact of COVID-19 in comparison to other regions in terms of human lives lost, it is no less facing dramatic economic and social consequences due to its many weaknesses. This report illustrates several of them, particularly those related to the health system. This report shows more by putting the long-term effects in perspective versus the short-term ones. It thus opens new perspectives as to the policies to be implemented to articulate the immediate responses to future challenges. Considering the diverse contexts in Africa, the report shows that there is no single COVID story in Africa. Only 10 African countries account for over 80% of the cases. Island nations suffer peculiar impacts. Rural-urban differentiation is evident. Socio-economic implications reveal gender biases. And also trade patterns matter. With positive news coming out on COVID-19 vaccines and the world rolling out vaccination campaign to hope looking at moving past the pandemic, we must be aware that going back to the business as usual will simply not work. It becomes imperative that we change our way of working and that we adapt our economy and behavior. It is under this pressure that we must seize the opportunity to build back better, to unlock transformations that will strengthen our social and planetary systems, so that people and the planet prosper together and support all countries to achieve high human development. As the COVID-19 crisis threatens to reverse global human development for the first time in 30 years, often hitting the people most in need the hardest and and widening inequalities between and within countries, we need to find hope and to build forward better, designing a future that looks beyond recovery towards 2030. At UNDP, I have to say that we acted quickly, as many others, to support national governments in preparing national COVID-19 responses. We adjusted programming, and we did that very quickly. At the regional level, we supported the CDC. So what have we learned? We have learned key points. First, social protection matters. Second, homegrown solutions matter. Third, international solidarity matters. And fourth, innovation matters. And I think the bedrock of all is the fifth one, social contract matter. So in concluding, the report has shown that the pandemic is challenging future with indirect mortality exceeding direct mortality by 2030, higher level of poverty in 2030 and 2050 relative to no COVID scenario, and long-lasting effects on the macroeconomic development of these 10 countries with projected lower level of GDP and shifts in international trade by 2030 and 2050. It is then an occasion to reflect on 3 points. And I would like to leave you with these 3 points and in a way, these 3 questions. Why the COVID-19 is a multiplier on the development challenges facing African countries today. The second point to reflect on, what do we need for building higher institutional and government capacity over the long term to building resilient economies, while also driving short-term economic growth that we haven't tried yet. We have tried many things over the years, so what do we need for building higher institutional capacity that we haven't tried yet? And finally, we are on the cusp of the start of trading of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It can be Africa's stimulus package if it is effectively implemented. Women and youth are waiting for the AFTA to reach them. They have created the businesses and they want the barriers down. So how can we ensure that the AFTA stimulates Africa recovery from COVID-19? So how can we ensure in a way that it becomes the stimulus package for Africa? So I would like to leave you with these 3 points of reflection to discuss during this webinar as well as part of the conclusion of this report. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was Noira Hamalaji, who's the Deputy Regional Director of the Africa Bureau of UNDP, talking about the key findings and takeaways from her perspective of the report. We now have a second keynote speaker, and you can already see him, he's there, and that is Jean-Denis Gabiki, who's the Acting Director of Economic Affairs at the African Union Commission. As I mentioned already, you will find his bio, which is long and distinguished, in the chat line. Jean-Denis, welcome to this meeting. It's lovely to see you. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts about the importance of this report. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Alex. On the onset, let me first convey to this meeting Commissioner Mochanga's regrets for not being able to be with us during this meeting. However, he strongly wished this launching session a success. So I'm going to make my opening remarks in French. So for those who will need the interpretation, they just can switch to French. Madame Noura Al-Malidi, directrice régionale adjointe du Bureau PNUD pour l'Afrique, Monsieur Alex, directeur de Chatham House, les membres de la communauté diplomatique, ainsi que distingués invités, mesdames et messieurs, permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier le Programme des Nations Unies pour le développement d'avoir invité la Commission de l'Union africaine à participer au lancement de cet important rapport, analysant les impacts socio-économiques à long terme de la COVID-19 dans diverses économies africaines. Permettez-moi également de rappeler que lorsque la pandémie a commencé, l'Afrique avait le moins de taux d'infection. À ce jour, cependant, plus de 3 millions de cas et plus de 100 000 décès sont enregistrés sur le continent. La COVID-19 a déjà causé d'importantes pertes pour des vies humaines. Les mesures prises en outre par divers gouvernements pour combattre cette pandémie ont déjà eu un impact négatif sur la plupart des économies africaines déjà fragilisées et perturbent plus d'une décennie du développement, posant donc ainsi le risque de retarder la réalisation et la mise en œuvre de l'agenda 63, ainsi que des objectifs de développement durable des Nations Unies. Le continent est aux prises avec la première récession en 25 ans. Comme clairement indiqué dans le rapport, l'Afrique a connu un ralentissement de la croissance, des investissements directs étrangers et des transferts de fonds exacerbant les défis budgétaires. Non seulement le continent lutte pour obtenir des ressources pour soutenir ses économies, mais aussi pour obtenir des ressources adéquates avec plus de 10 milliards de dollars nécessaires pour l'acquisition de vaccins pour sa population, y compris les travailleurs de première ligne et les personnes vulnérables. Bien entendu, les économies avancées ont subi également des chocs négatifs causés par la pandémie. Cependant, le risque de reprise rapide dans ces pays sera amorcé grâce à la résilience et la diversification de ces économies, contrairement aux économies africaines. Mesdames et messieurs, distingués invités, les défis présentés dans le rapport qui fait l'objet de cette session aujourd'hui obligent le continent à construire des économies résilientes accompagnées d'une croissance inclusive et durable. Pour y parvenir, des actions audacieuses et courageuses doivent être mises en œuvre. La dette acquise et accumulée doit être soutenue par des investissements et des projets qui génèrent des ressources pour assurer le service de la dette. Les politiques fiscales et monétaires devraient également être réorganisées pour assurer la continuité du soutien des dépenses publiques et de la performance en ce qui concerne les paiements de transferts et les dépenses directes pour l'éducation, la santé, les infrastructures et d'autres biens publics. La mobilisation des ressources domestiques est devenue urgente et impérative. Selon le Fonds monétaire international, l'Afrique a besoin d'environ 890 milliards de dollars d'ici 2023. Évidemment, les contributions des flux financiers privés, des institutions financières internationales et les donateurs bilatéraux et d'autres institutions financières sont également attendus. Cependant, un déficit de financement de 290 milliards de dollars d'ici 2023 est également annoncé par le Fonds monétaire international. Le continent doit donc ainsi renforcer les initiatives en cours, y compris les partenariats pour améliorer la mobilisation des ressources domestiques. Cela inclut également la lutte contre les flux financiers illicites, en particulier dans le commerce de matières premières et le renforcement des administrations fiscales ainsi que de la gouvernance économique. Mesdames et messieurs, la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, lancée en janvier 2021, est impérative pour la reprise post-Covid pour les économies africaines. Accélérer le développement industriel reste essentiel et le potentiel de reconfiguration des chaînes de valeur mondiales et peut-être développer une plus grande dépendance vis-à-vis des chaînes de valeur régionales. On s'attend donc à davantage de possibilités d'emploi grâce à une capacité de production accrue facilitée par les investissements dans la technologie numérique, la modernisation et la diversification économique. L'inclusion économique et financière et un soutien accru aux femmes et aux jeunes, ainsi qu'au secteur privé, favoriseront et augmenteront la consommation et stimuleront la croissance. En outre, chers participants, l'achèvement à long terme des négociations sur les droits de propriété intellectuelle dans le cadre de la ZLECAf sera également essentiel. Cela stimulera et encouragera l'innovation qui soutiendra à son tour la diversification des exportations et permettra le développement d'une industrie pharmaceutique et médicale générique sur le continent, ce qui garantira donc l'accès à des soins de santé abordables pour les populations africaines. En retour, cela également contribuera à réduire le taux de mortalité croissant à long terme chez les enfants et à l'ensemble de la population. Pour conclure, Dr Alex et distingués participants, guidés donc par les effets néfastes à long terme attendus de la COVID présentés dans ce rapport, la mise en œuvre des recommandations pour le rétablissement à moyen terme et à moyen et à long terme du continent après la pandémie est essentielle pour créer la résilience et l'autonomie de notre continent et sauver des vies. Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention.
Thank you very much, Jean-Denis Gabinki, who is the Acting Director of Economic Affairs at the African Union Commission, for giving the second keynote address and introducing this report to our audience, who are both on Facebook Live and on Zoom. I will now turn to introduce the author and key editor of the report, whose name is Dr. Raymond Gilpin. He's the chief economist of the Africa Bureau with the United Nations Development Programme. And prior to that, as you'll see in his resume CV on the chat line, he was the Dean of the African Center for Strategic Studies, ACSS, of the National Defense University in Washington, DC. Raymond, lovely to see you. Congratulations on the report. I know that it's taken about a year to put together, and that it was work of many people, some of them who are here today. And I look forward to hearing from you on how you see the long-term socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 across all those so diverse contexts that Noira and Jean-Denis has highlighted already. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for those kind words, and thank you also to you for hosting us for this event. I'd like to start by recognizing all the partnerships that have been instrumental in this effort. Thank you so much, Jean-Denis Gabakini for joining us from the African Union. The African Union has been the reason why we have done this, because we do believe that those regional ties are very, very important as we think through these issues relating to not just COVID, but socio-economic welfare. I'd also like to acknowledge three institutions whose partnership has been fundamental as we've not just thought through the report, but prepared it and brought it to this level. The Frederick S. Pardee Center at University of Denver, Institute for Security Studies in South Africa, and the Gordon School at University of Pretoria. Special thanks go to Professors Willem Verhagen and Jonathan Moyer, who are with us this morning, who I think have been the principal authors of our report. Why are we doing another COVID study? I think that it's very important, as Noura Hamlaji, our director, mentioned earlier, is that normally when you see a lot of the analysis on COVID in Africa, it's as though you have a single Africa story. There isn't. Africa has suffered from the pandemic variously. And we did this study because we want to demonstrate that COVID is impacting Africa differently. And therefore our approach to understanding and addressing COVID has also to be nuanced to take up country cases into country specificities into consideration. Second, why these 10 countries? We would have liked to cover the entire continent, but time and resources made that difficult. So we decided to select countries that reflect the geographical diversity of Africa. We have two island nations. We have nations from Eastern, Southern, Central, and Western Africa. And so this is why this is how we ended up in with these 10 countries. And what's new in the report? I think what's new in the report is a focus on not just highlighting the diverse contexts, but also discussing specific policy recommendations that make sense. So what's the approach been for this paper? I think the approach generally has been to look at COVID, not just as an epidemiological issue, the health effects, but see how these effects have affected domestic, economic, and social drivers, like the response to the virus socially, societal capacity to mitigate the economic fallout as second-order effects, and a third-order effect, look at how what's going on outside Africa, international flows, are affecting and influencing Africa. We have not done a comprehensive analysis of all the impacts and all the factors, but we are focusing on three issues: on the COVID mortality, COVID's impact on domestic economic growth, and COVID's impact on trade. And so these are the three main issues that we are considering. And we considered it in the context of international futures model, which projects a multiplicity of variables. And our colleagues at University of Denver's Pardee Center house this model. And this model has enabled us to do both the quantitative and qualitative research necessary to look at not just what's happening with COVID currently at the country level in these 10 countries, but what's likely to happen over the long term. And what we are seeing is that there's a strong variation across countries. whether you're looking at it from the economic growth, and we see Mauritius and Mali being illustrated here. There are different pathways, different trajectories, and looking at it from the epidemiological side and the trade side, it's very important to focus on these variations. And the model looked at the long-term implications, highlighting 4 scenarios. First scenario is no COVID. Second scenario, which is the top curve here. Second scenario is what if there is a relief and rebound, if we recover quickly. Then we have the base case, and then there's a global suffering case, i.e. things go really bad. In each case, we could see that COVID, that's at 2020, 1920, has a long-term impact. And therefore, when we think about what we need to do, we have to be able to focus on the longer-term issues. I'm going to be very brief in discussing the impacts. Our panelists will unpack this a little bit more. But let's start with mortality. We currently look at the mortality rate and see how many people are currently dying because of COVID. And what this report has done has shown that over time, the number of people who die indirectly, i.e. those who probably cannot afford or do not have access to primary health care, those who are not well served because limited capacities in countries are now directed to COVID. We see that a lot more people die indirectly over time because of COVID-19. So COVID-19 is not just a current health crisis, it's a potential future health crisis, because even if we have the vaccine, we have herd immunity, and COVID deaths decrease, the lingering effects on the healthcare system will persist for many years to come. The second is in terms of economic growth. And we see that the African countries, we did illustrate Mali and Mauritius. We see that there are different impacts because it all depends on the trading partners that the various African countries have. If countries that are more integrated into global value chains tend to be a lot more vulnerable and susceptible to adverse longer-term impacts. Third thing is trade. What the report is showing that over time, COVID is likely to cause a general shift towards China and away from the EU and India as Africa's major trading partners. This has a lot of implications that the report documents, but it is also important to know that for some African countries, not all African countries, intra-African trade could be affected. So as we think over the long term, so as we think about pathways related to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, I think we have to take this on board as well. What are some of the recommendations that the report highlights? The first is that the analysis that we do for COVID-19 in Africa has to be both system-wide and integrated. System-wide and integrated because whether you're looking at it from the health or the economic growth or the trade perspectives, they are all interlinked. And governance capacity is key to not just addressing the impacts of COVID, but recovering. The report is very clear on the centrality of governance capacity in addressing these issues. And secondly, we have to be anticipatory in policy formulation. There's a lot of immediate reaction, but as we understand the longer term implications, we could be a lot more anticipatory in our policy design. The second thing is that we need to build towards resilience, not just in terms of economic resilience, but the resilience of populations, particularly marginalized and disadvantaged populations like women, the youth, and those who live in rural areas. COVID has exacerbated a number of prior conditions, but this is a great time for us to regroup and focus on resilience once again in the African continent. And this requires strategic investments in the health systems and also in economic transformation in initiatives. This is not going to happen unless a lot more is done to bolster domestic resource mobilization in African countries and across the African continent, not just from an illicit financial flows perspective, but from the importance of ensuring that Africa's abundance of natural resources does translate into sort of economic issues, that economic transformation we're looking for. And the last general takeaway is that Africa needs to manage economic interdependencies strategically. The report is clear that we're likely to see a change over time in terms of Africa's trading partners and the direction of Africa's trade, and also the looking at the potentials and the possibilities that the Africa continental free trade area presents. There needs to be a lot of focus over the short term on how we put in place policies and mechanisms to ensure that Africa's trade is strengthened and intra-African trade is bolstered to ensure that we have the sort of outcomes that we're looking for. In a nutshell, these are the main conclusions, but I'll be posting a link to the report. Apologies, I posted a link earlier in the chat room that's not, that appears to be broken. Hopefully before the end of this event, we'll post a working link so that you'll be able to see this yourself. So thank you once again, and over to you, Alex.
Raymond, thank you very much. And indeed, we did repost the link. And so if anybody wants to download or get access to the report that Raymond has spoken about, you've got the link there and easy to click and get hold of it. So we still have reasonable time, and I'm moving now to 3 discussants to talk about what the report has meant for them and what are some of the key findings and takeaways. So the first discussant we have is Professor Njunga Ndungu, who is the Executive Director of the African Economic Research Consortium in Nairobi. So Professor Njungu, thank you very much indeed for participating today. And a reminder to everybody that if you want more of his esteemed biography, it is in the chat line. You can find it there. With no more ado, I'll hand over to you, Prof. Look forward to hearing your remarks. Please begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I never noticed that my name was that difficult. It is easy. It's just the way it is written, Jogona Ndomu. Thank you very much for being in this panel, and I thank UNDP for actually giving ARC this chance to actually comment on what we feel is a very, very strategic directions in terms of the analysis that has been done by this report, and also at the country level in terms of actually seeing what is the post-COVID economic recovery strategy that we are likely to put up with. You know, what I had done was to prepare 3 slides, although I don't know whether it is possible to share them. And I wanted to use those slides just to make just 3 points Let me see how I can, let me see whether I can share them, and that will give you, I'll make sure that I don't overstay my time, because most of the time that is what the temptation with the slides, with coming up with the slides is actually to overstay your time. I'll make sure that I don't overstay my time. Are they visible? Are the slides visible?
Yeah, we can see them. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, fantastic. And I think the impact of the and emerging opportunities are very, very critical to look at. And I always remind you that ARC is a capacity building and knowledge generation in Africa. And that is why policy making is very important for us, because that capacity is very important for policy and for policy advice. And we want to build capacity for both institutions that lead the institutional policy making, as well as network of individuals that are very, very important for the continent. Having said that, let me say the first point is I want to make is that initial conditions matter. And we have seen that situation was already worsening even before the COVID. And even now, when the COVID has hit us, it has exacerbated the condition. And I think my friend Raymond has really emphasized on some of these effects. But the second matter on initial condition is Africa started from a very weak position. And now we are seeing the recession is biting. The fiscal space is being diminished, but the debt crisis is looming. And I remember we had even this conference on debt, the looming debt crisis, way back in 2019, June. And it was clear that there was a major problem coming up. But debt accumulation, and this is maybe the pitfalls in Africa, is that debt accumulation was never accompanied with capital accumulation to support capacity for future growth. And this is where I call it the policy pitfalls. So even when we are looking at the way forward in terms of the post-COVID economic recovery, we have to remember that we put ourselves in a very tight position by limiting our capacity for future growth. Having done that, of course, we have looked at even household poverty, and we have shown that actually the results that we are seeing during the COVID time, the first perhaps 1 year of COVID, a bit of that, has shown that actually it is reversing some of the gains on poverty reduction and inequality in African countries. It's just reversing like the efforts that has gone on for the last 20 years. We have a sample of 5 countries, but it's something that we can document further as we continue doing the analysis in this. I like this report, and I'm summarizing it in terms of the impact of the pandemic at the country level. And I've seen these are issues that also Raymond talked about. Economic activity has plummeted, country level mortality, reduced trade, prospects of reduced FDI, and for countries in Africa that depend very much on these investments, and even prospects of reduced remittances. The issue now is what factors will shape the long-run growth in Africa. And we have seen examples in terms of how poverty has been affected, human capital development, especially education, health, food security, and nutrition. These are very, very pertinent factors that we really need to look at. And the initial conditions and the failure of structural transformation is for us is something that we really need to ponder. But more importantly, institutional failure problem has been more critical, and it is going to be more critical even in future as a lesson for us, more than even resource endowments. And I liked the effects, first order effect, second order effects, and third order effects. I really like this, and this is a very good summary. And even what Raymond has talked about, the analysis of the 10 countries. We do believe that these are the factors that we're going to live with. But then we ask ourselves, what does Africa require for the right post-COVID economic recovery strategy? And the starting point for me is actually an argument that we really need structural economic transformation more than ever before. And we do know that we have paid some lip service for many years. And this is something that we really want to reverse. If you want to see some details about this, there's a paper by ARC and DAI, and I think Urea is also in the conference, the COVID-19 pandemic and structural transformation in Africa and evidence for action. This is going to be a very critical issue because we really need to change this. We need institutional reforms. And you know, by the way, Africa does not reform without a crisis, but also I always want people that don't go looking for a crisis so that we can have reform. But what we really are advising now is that we take advantage of the current crisis to institute structural reforms. The model, for example, the model of global cooperation has not structurally changed. And this is what this paper by Julia and others has said, because essentially we cannot even succeed in continental free trade area without actually even reforming the global value chain. But who holds the key to these reforms? And this is something that we need to ask ourselves. We need to invest in a universal social protection system to overcome poverty and inequality. And we have the current ARC work on growth, inequality, poverty, and redistribution has come up with a conclusion that we need not pro-poor growth strategy, as everybody has said. We have reversed that to say we need pro-growth poverty reduction strategy in Africa. And this is what is going to help African economies to recover. My final slide is that let me dwell on structural economic transformation in African economies, and which I'm actually arguing it is more urgent now. First, the role of institutions in shaping economic behavior is more fundamental than factor endowments. And this is now summarized in the lot of literature that is coming up in terms of what we need in terms of dynamic economic transformation. Institutions are important because they shape the legal framework, or what I call the rules of the game, but they also define appropriate incentives or even penalties, whichever way you look at it, for economic behavior. And that is why we are emphasizing that it is more important than factor endowments. For example, I can give an example. We talked about import substitution strategy in Africa in the last 60 years, and it failed, but nobody knows why. We know that it is the basic problem was capital accumulation. Poverty trap in African countries is sustained by this program of capital accumulation, and the efforts are never adequate to cross the thresholds required to effect the structural transformation. And when we have seen opportunities arising, for example, we finance capital accumulation through debt to finance infrastructure, governance issues step in. So we also have a combination of poor government facilitation program and failures that actually provoke some coordination failure and even market failure. So in a sense, what we're really saying is that we would like to see how the long-term visions are going to be transformed. For example, we have had long-term vision. For me, it was a promise of long-term periods of policy clarity. And it is time we can make assessment and ask ourselves where we are from there. And that is for us very, very critical. So we actually say the strategy for the future is, we know we started from a weak position, we are in this problem now, but how do we come out of it? And that is why I have provided some of the examples in terms of what we may consider. And I do believe they can work, but they can work right now because we feel the pain and the pinch of actually having failed to structurally transform economies in Africa. I'm left to say asante sana for that short intervention, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ndungu. And maybe if we can have your slides, we can make sure that they are available for everybody. That will be very helpful. You've put a lot of work into this. That will be really great.
Thank you very much. I'll share them.
Thank you very much, Prof. So our next discussant is Professor Bernadette Diacamia, and she's an international development consultant. Professor Bernadette, thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your commentary about the report.
Thank you, Chair. I would like first to thank the organizers for the opportunity given to me to be part of this special event. And also, I would like to join the readers of this report to commend the authors on this piece of work. I like it very much, and Njuguna went over all the detail in terms of comment. So my point would be on poverty incidence, and then on what kind of a diversification Africa should be looking for. In terms of poverty incidence, it increased, and the report is very clear on the drivers internally. The drivers, we have two drivers internally, at least two drivers. The first one is the reductions in economic growth, and the second one is the changes in the distribution of household income. These are the two internal drivers that the report mentioned. Then externally, we have the declining remittances. government responded to that, responded to the increased poverty incidence through cash transfers. But in the longer run, they cannot sustain cash transfers because of the already high level of debt, as well the declining government revenue and the small avenues for domestic resource collection. This has been said by Dennis as well. So what should be done? We observe people across the countries. The first thing, the increase in poverty incidence came out of the loss of job. So in terms of alternative policy measures that we could think about, I would say, in the medium term, first we should think about protecting jobs. In the medium term, we should first think about protecting jobs. And to that, we have two major actions that we should think about. First, support the cost of keeping firm in business, notably for them to keep the employees. The second action to protect jobs is to support for quick recovery of small and medium-sized enterprises, notably in the informal sector, including smallholder agricultural activities, because they hold the greatest number of employment. And still in the medium term, we should think about supporting for production and trade in services with emphasis on action such as information technology, enabling infrastructure services such as telecommunication, transportation, energy, and finance. And a third action would be securing labor-intensive services, notably the professional services. In the long term, what would we need if we do not want to resort to cash transfer? In the longer run, we should think about policies that will create jobs. So if we are saying that in the short run, we should, in the medium term, I mean, we should, protect a job. Those jobs existing that are being lost, we should protect them. But in the longer run, we should create additional jobs. What should we do then? For that, we should implement an active industrial policy and enable industrialization, that with a greater use of a digital means of production to reduce the cost. As well, we should think about enhanced connectivity despite the social distancing. And Njuguna thought about that in length. Still in the longer term, we should significantly reduce the inequality of opportunity. That will be required to induce a greater effect of aggregate growth on income inequality and on poverty incidence. The policy menu will comprise actions such as improving human capital, improving access to finance, good governance, promoting productive and inclusive structural transformation. And specifically on the inclusiveness, we should think about enabling inclusive business by increasing the number of enterprises by enabling the number of inclusive businesses to increase. We will address the issue of the base of the pyramid, where we have the greatest number of the vulnerable group. As well, the second component of the question put to me or of my intervention is to know what kind of diversification should Africa be looking for. Okay, we may think of the following two avenues. Actually, we cannot disentangle one from the other one, but we can at least present them in two avenues. The first one is production diversification. And the diversification should be done into tradable services and agro-industry. In the process, agglomeration will secure productivity, whereas enhanced firm capabilities will allow them to compete in the globalized market. The second avenue of diversification is export diversification, but that cannot be done without considering some sophistication in terms of product differentiation, in terms of production fragmentation, in terms of resource availability, and of course, with a good deal of overproduction factors. So, Mr. Chair, these are the points that I wanted to make. In short, in the shorter run, think about saving, protecting jobs. In the longer term, thinking about creating jobs. In terms of this will be done in terms of diversification into production and diversification into export. Thank you very much.
Professor Bernadette, thank you very much, including emphasizing the importance of diversification. We have one more discussant, and then we'll be moving to the Q&A phase. And so I want to invite Dr. Dusina Yeo, who's the Head of Economic Policy and Research Division at the African Union Commission in Addis. So Dr. Dusina, over to you.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor to comment on the report that you have just presented. So my internet is very weak. You have also see my face. Let me turn off my camera so that I can be able to speak. You can hear me because the internet is very weak here.
That's fine, go ahead.
So the question that have been posed to me, let me start by really commending in UNDP for this excellent report that reflects much significance in analyzing the short and long-term macroeconomic dynamic of the COVID-19 at this critical moment when the world at large is exploring many ways to build back better and create a resilient economic to future shock. So a lot has been said by your presentation, even by Jean-Denis, who is the Director of the Economic Affairs Department, about the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 on Africa. So I will not really much on that. What I would like to say at the onset is at the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa really shows remarkably slow infection rate compared to other regions, but the story is also changing now in the continent. At least 40 countries are experiencing a second wave of the pandemic, and the new deadly variant is also emerging in Southern Africa region. So we all see that Africa is really heavily dependent on external source partners. We have about 83% on external trade, 90% pharmaceutical products. International tourism represent 8.5% of Africa GDP, and overall 23 million jobs created in tourism industry. In many African countries, remittances represent at least 10% of their GDP. ODA, foreign official development assistance, represent also more than 10% of gross national income for many countries. FDI also is exceeding 5% of the overall Africa GDP. So all these sources, all these partners that are external, any crisis coming from them, coming from external, is likely to affect Africa because we are really dependent on external partners and external and development partners. So for Africa, as AU is concerned, to reverse this situation, the most critical roadmap is to revive and build more resilient, more diversified, and more indigenous African economy by putting in place all the ingredients for the successful implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area that has just been launched on the 1st January 2021, which is the economic game changer for the entire continent. The CFTA has the potential to unleash the future circle, where the opportunity of larger market trigger increased trade and investment, leading to export diversification, productivity gain, and also greater value added and employment, but improving income and achieving sustainable development on the continent. And for us to achieve this, I have 5 remedies that I'm proposing in my presentation, my comment. So we need to really build a strong health system by increasing public and private investment in health sector and support local production of medical and health supply and vaccine. We cannot continue to rely on external partners to produce, to give us all the production supply that we need in our health sector. We need also to reduce health dependence. A lot of patients are oriented to be going abroad to be cured about any disease. And we think that we need to really stop that. And our dependence in international supply, and also 90% are import on pharmaceutical products. So with newly agencies that have been created, the African Medicine Agency, we believe that everything needs to put together to make sure that this agency is operational in the coming years. 2, many discussions have said it, we need to really expedite productive transformation on the continent. We need to really change the development strategy, trajectory of the continent from the current commodity-driven growth to raw material-based industrialization. We have a lot of potential in mining, in the agricultural sector, and we need to really develop a vertical policy intervention, which is really critical. Africa must stop 50 billion food import from outside. This is not acceptable. With a high level of potential that we have in the agricultural sector, we continue importing food products from abroad. We need also to liberate entrepreneurship policy from the gain of numbers and emphasizing more on quality entrepreneurship, vibrant, competitive, and innovative and growth inspiring entrepreneur and firm. More importantly, facilitating the emerging or local giant enterprises like South Korea, like Asia countries, enterprises that can participate in the regional and global value chain using the comparative advantages of countries to boost production capacity in select sectors, both at regional and national level. No foreign countries, no foreign investor cannot invest in a country where there is no local successful company. 3, we need to invest in world-class infrastructure. We cannot trade among ourselves, connecting, improving our productive capacity without energy. We cannot connect producer to market without road, without transport. So we think that this needs to be in place so that we can boost intra-African import, intra-African trade, export, and also deepen in continental integration. 4, harnessing digital technology. We can accelerate productive transformation, make the continent more resilient to future shock. As you are well aware, COVID-19 has really showcased the importance of the utilization of digital technology across all sectors. Digital transformation can potentially create several economic and social efficiency for millions of people in Africa by increasing financial inclusion, access to quality education, access to quality health services, market leakages, SMEs growth, better farming income and food and nutrition security, and effectiveness in which also effectiveness of government services. That can also really, we need to also increase investment in digital infrastructure, skill, cross-border connectivity, along with regulation for data governance and privacy, and also that African countries are better positioned to respond to the future shock. The last remedy that I'm proposing is to really have a sustainable source of financing. We cannot continue to rely on ODA. ODA cannot develop Africa. So we need to really improve our domestic resource mobilization, broaden our tax system, and from formal sector representing about 70% of Africa GDP in some countries. So we need to tax fair. We need to find a way to tax informal economy. We need to strengthen tax administration. We need also to tax digital economy. We are working with OECD on that. We need also to fight against illicit financial flow, particularly on commodity trade. Africa cannot continue relying on external financing. We know that the tax to GDP ratio in Africa is 70%. This is the lowest as compared to other regions like OECD countries and Latin American countries. So we need to really improve our ratio, tax ratio to GDP. So we need also to improve governance and transparency in acquiring debt and ensure proper management and its utilization by investing in productive areas in order to generate resources that can serve the debt and also achieve sustainable development of the continent. So these are my few remarks and my comment on your report. I think that you have really.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lucina Yao, for those very helpful comments, adding to the discussion we already had. Also emphasizing the need to move away from reliance of ODA, improving infrastructures, not only the physical ones, but also the digital ones, among other points. Look, I'm delighted that we can have one more discussant who was unable to join us initially, but is now here with us. And that's Dr. Patricia Laverly, and she's the Deputy Finance Minister of Sierra Leone. Honourable Minister, thank you very much for joining us today. And I'll hand over to you for some 5 minutes of comments, if you could make them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think the host doesn't have my video turned on.
Yeah, we're trying to get the slide down, Honourable Minister. I'm hoping that the slide will go down right now.
Okay.
What I suggest is if you start making your comments, everybody will see you in a moment, so we don't lose time.
Yes. Okay. Look, thank you again for inviting me to join you for this very important discussion. For us in Sierra Leone, given the gains that we have achieved relative to our other countries, we hope that by the end of this year, COVID-19 would hopefully be a thing of the past. But let me just start out by giving you a little bit of background about the context for us in Sierra Leone. Remember, in 2014, Sierra Leone was hit with the Ebola pandemic. And this was followed by a sharp fall in our main commodity, iron ore. This experience left us with some hard lessons, which has helped us in dealing with the COVID-19 situation. We experienced our index case on March 31st of last year. Of course, like all other countries, Sierra Leone was negatively impacted by COVID. Overall, all economic activities essentially slowed down, both public and private. While the length and the severity of the impact of COVID-19 is still difficult to ascertain, it's still very difficult to ascertain. The immediate shocks are obviously the revenue decrease, the decreased budget deficit and balance of payments. That's in the short term. However, in the longer term, we would only know for sure in the next 5 to 7 years. Now, in Sierra Leone, because of our current challenges, pre-COVID, Sierra Leone was we're still dealing with our Ebola victims in March. We're still supporting them with their, providing their means of livelihood, helping them get by as a result of Ebola. A few months later, we were dealing with the COVID victims. So we're dealing with a double victim pandemic situation. We've been dealing with that for the last year now. Now, in response to COVID, we came up with a quick action economic response program. And this program has 2 strategic pillars. The first addresses, we had both a health response program as well as an economic response program. Let me just clarify. The health response program focuses on 2 important priorities. The first was to address the threats and risks to essentially intercept the spread of the virus. The second was to enhance the capability to deal with the risks and prevent transmission across the country. So 1, intercept the spread, increase capability, and 2, prevent the spread of transmission. And I believe we managed, relative to our Ebola situation, our numbers are still fairly low. In terms of the economic response, that we formulated as a result of COVID, we of course had both a monetary response where we worked with our central bank to provide short-term loans to primarily our importers of essential commodities. That way we can keep our economy afloat and to basically save lives. Essential commodity, we provided loans to our importers for rice, fuel, oil, essential commodities in the country. The second economic response that we came up with was tax incentives. We deferred taxes to our importers. We also provided loans. We launched a Munafa fund and provided microloans to our micro enterprises. And that process is still ongoing. We've also recently launched a new loan, the Munafa Fund. It's about $10 million initially, and that will be rolled out across the countries to support our micro enterprises. We obviously also provided social safety nets to vulnerable groups, as well as to businesses that were adversely affected by the pandemic. These are just some of the economic measures that we provided in response to the pandemic. Now,
thank you very much.
Oh, I haven't. Can I continue?
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, please. Yeah. Just a few more minutes because we need some Q&A time also. Please, Minister, go ahead.
Vaccines. We're about to roll out our vaccines. Okay, and Sierra Leone we have a population of about 8 million. We've ordered about 2 million vaccines, and we expect to administer 2 million by the end of the year. Of course, we're increasing our budgetary allocation in the health sector and improving our manufacturing environment, because what we're now trying to do in Sierra Leone is to obviously better support our local industries, you know, and the private sector. And there's a big boost. We have a big package, a set of activities lined up immediately after, while we're administering the vaccines, to support our local industries. That way we can jumpstart the economy again in the post-COVID environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister Patricia Lovely, Deputy Finance Minister of Sierra Leone. We now have about 20 minutes. I'll finish slightly late, about 5 minutes late is the plan, to allow for some good discussion. I have one question, I know, from Professor Willem Verhagen, who's one of the authors of the UNDP report. So Willem, Prof, if you'd like to ask your question, go ahead. Please just unmute yourself and ask your question. And yeah, there you are, just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you very much, Alex. Hello, everyone. My name is Willem Verhagen, and we have conducted the work for this report together with researchers from the ISS Africa and GIPS under the leadership of UNDP. The Party Center is a not-for-profit academic center based at the University of Denver, and the work at our center centers around the International Futures Model, which is a free-to-use and open-source modeling platform that is kind of uniquely suited to explore questions around long-term SDG achievement across countries and regions. We work with various international organizations such as UNDP, several UNDP country offices in the African Union, and we would want to thank our colleagues from UNDP and especially Fatma Ahmed and Raymond Gilpin for their guidance and support throughout this research project. So I think officially, Alex, the idea was more that a question would have been posed towards me, but I'm also more than happy to kind of jump in and pose a question if I'm allowed to. So maybe kind of taking the long-term perspective within a crisis, the question kind of becomes, how can we make kind of these type of reports even more accessible and usable towards policymakers in order to kind of, from this very kind of large-scale macroeconomic perspective, which really talks about kind of the long-term perspective towards 2030 and 2050, and really talks about indeed kind of what I saw in the Q&A about kind of what should be done, but less maybe focus on how it should be done, to kind of translate those findings towards more kind of actionable policymakers is something that we would be very interested to learn from all of your experience on this call. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Willem. I'm going to ask a few more questions and then turn to various people on the panel and speakers. The first one is Celestine Malanda. If we could unmute Celestine and have Celestine ask the question. Please introduce yourself, Celestine. Are you there, Celestine Malanda? Otherwise, I'm going to move on. Okay. So the next one that had their hand up is Richard Moncrieff. So let's unmute Richard and invite Richard to introduce himself and ask the question. Nice to see you, Richard.
Hello, thank you. Can you just say that my audio is okay?
Yep, can hear you clearly, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm Richard Moncrieff, and I'm just asking the question from the point of view of someone who lives in Africa, actually, not so much from an institutional point of view. I live in Kenya, and last year, the government closed all schools in Kenya for the entire school year. That's the whole of last calendar year. This seems to be associated with a rise in child labour, long-term school dropouts, and domestic violence and abuse. Now, I don't know if that's entirely representative of the continent, but I'd like to use it to pose a question to the panel, which is, what does the panel think of the risks that some of the government measures taken to restrict the spread of COVID are doing far greater damage in terms of short-term morbidity and longer-term economic damage than the virus itself. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. And we have another hand that is up. And so we'll invite Judith Kabojulisi to ask her question. Judith, thank you very much for putting your hand up. Please go ahead and ask your question. We're unmuting you.
Am I okay?
We can hear you.
All right, thank you very much.
Clearly.
So, but my question, thank you very much to all the presenters and the panel. My question goes to the panel and actually everyone there about how we should be implementing or going about the recommendations in the report. Dr. Yop from the African Union, if I'm not mistaken, stated one of the things that build strong domestic health systems dependent on domestic resources. But how do we mobilize domestic resources for health when the political will does not really exist in many of the African countries? You will notice that many of the African countries have not even achieved the 15% Abuja Declaration recommendation. So I'm just wondering that how can we be more specific? How do we approach the political wing of these countries to try and channel resources to the health sector, rather than just talking about it? Many governments, I come from Uganda personally, although I live in the UK now, that governments tend to create more and bigger administrative structures for political patronage, which end up taking resources away from these social services that are essential. So how exactly are we going to navigate that, or should we navigate that kind of thing? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judith. So we have several questions that have been asked. Maybe I'll go first to Raymond as the kind of author and editor-in-chief of the report to reflect initially, and then we'll ask a few other panelists to contribute. Raymond.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the questioners. In the interest of time, I'll just focus on one, that's relating to the political will to do the right thing. The questioner is absolutely right. We need to move away from just saying what we need to do and how we need to do it. As regards domestic resource mobilization, there is a growing amount of political will across the continent to do this, because what COVID and vaccine nationalism have made very clear to Africa is that we cannot rely on handouts to develop. We have to focus on how best to garner our own resources. Dr. Laverly from Sierra Leone, Deputy Finance Minister, just talked about a couple of interventions that the government there is making to address this issue. More broadly, from a domestic resource mobilization angle, I think there's three things that governments need to do a lot more. One, rationalize the taxation legislation, so it's clear, it's easy to understand, easy to implement. Secondly, improve capacity. You can't have people who are supposed to be part of the revenue generation mechanism not being paid or being paid very poorly. You have to improve capacity to ensure that you can do this. And secondly, governments are beginning to demonstrate value, because the reason why people would want to pay the taxes, that a couple of people have mentioned, is when they see the benefits of paying the taxes. Things like the Monarch Fund in Sierra Leone signal to people that there is a social contract. And I think that's what we need to work on, and we're seeing steps towards that in many countries. Thank you so much. Over to you, Alex. Thank you very much.
There was a question that drew on the Kenya experience. So I'm wondering if Professor Ndungu, that you have any reflections that you'd like to add in response to any of these questions.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think that was a fantastic question and proposition. But it starts from the very beginning that the first line of defense when you are hit by a crisis like the COVID is actually to protect lives. And by the way, if you look at the whole of the world, actually we went into lockdown. We followed especially what happened in China. That was the technology in phase, in action. But of course, as the question has been raised, actually it has consequences, very severe consequences. And it's going to have a long-term effect, because essentially, even when you look at it in terms of protecting lives, the lockdown itself maimed most of the people in terms of, for example, the urban dwellers who didn't have any income, and there was no social protection mechanism. Over time, countries realize that they can go into virtual running processes, but especially the effects of domestic violence and even the poverty that is ravaged most of the population, these are the costs of the first line of trying to protect lives, and we are going to be with it for a long time. But let me also face the other side of it. Now, having persevered or having gone through this, now we have, like in Kenya right now, they're talking about the third wave, and they are going to talk about lockdowns, and even everybody's questioning political rallies and even reopening of schools and what is happening in the third wave. The bottom line is that we have to persevere the short-term distressing factors for us to protect the future, protect the lives, protect private investments and all that. But I think the whole manner of the report, the message from the report is that we have to effect reforms in the long term. And those reforms are going to address some of these issues. But in the short term, there is a lot of pain, as it has been alluded to, because essentially the technology of managing the COVID was actually the same across countries. See what is happening in Tanzania, because they did not adopt that technology of managing the COVID. Right now, they are facing the most severest of the crisis in terms of the COVID. So that was the technology then, it was working, but it has its own consequences. Now, the next question is, how do we live down these consequences and try to alleviate those in the long term? And this is why we are trying to say, let's push for reforms. Those package of reforms are going to help us in terms of recovery, but that does not mean that we forget the technology of managing the pandemics. That will be a major important lesson to learn in the future.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read out a few questions and come to some of the other panelists. So there's one here from Giza Gaspar Martins, who I do know is in Luanda. He's a friend of mine. And he asks, how many and where are there COVID recovery packages in Africa? So just bear that in mind. That's one of the questions. Another one is from Jeanette Mondungu Kamara, is what about raising bank and institutional financing of the economy as a way forward? And there was another one that I saw, another question, which was from Anne Moisan, who is, are there new opportunities in Africa to replace the West supply chain dependency on China, especially with the free trade agreement? In what specific areas that would re-establish African countries as the preferred source? Can this lead to greater African integration? I think that's also a question that maybe Professor Willem as an author might like to address. I'll turn to him again. I'm aware that European planners, EU planners, are talking about having to change their supply chains as a lesson of COVID to be less reliant on China and maybe looking at West Africa. So the findings of the UNDP report about that there's going to be more interconnectivity with China away from Europe and India. Well, it's a question to the panel. Maybe it will be regional. Maybe bits of West Africa will not follow the same pattern as East Africa, a question at least. And then Eunice Kamwendo said, couldn't agree more with Professor Ndugu on structural transformation and institutional reform, two critical pieces of the puzzle for resilience and development in Africa. So less of a question, but more of a kind of endorsement. And several people agreed with that. So I'm going to turn to some of the panelists and keynote speakers that we haven't heard from. So for example, first of all, I'm going to ask Noira if she has any responses that she'd like to add. Maybe she's gone. I did see she was there, but she may have moved on because we're running over time now. So Jean-Denis, if you're still here, maybe you've also gone actually, I can see. Oh no, there you go, please. If you can unmute yourself, that would be very helpful.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was saying that, thank you, Alex, for the for the floor, and also the question came from Mrs. Jadit. No, she was asking how to improve the implementation of the recommendations that always, we provide as technical people. I mean, because we also has, let's say, the Commission, we have published already 2 reports on the impact of COVID on African economies. And this question always are asked by, African citizens or diaspora. How do we make sure that the recommendations are fully implemented, and also member states are fully involved in the process of implementation of this one? So for us, as let's say the Commission, what we usually do, member states, we can't push them. I mean, there is no way for the Commission to force member states to implement any recommendations. But for us, the first is the awareness campaign, the sensitization, and also the capacity building for our member states. And finally, we should also make our member states understand that there is more consequences by doing nothing than by trying to do something. So these are kind of actions that the Commission can take to make sure that all recommendation that comes from technical people or from scientifics or academics are, implemented as recommended. For us, the most important is to make sure that member states are well equipped technically to understand the consequences of doing nothing, and also for us to keep awareness and sensitization campaign. That's the only thing we can do as the AU Commission. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much. Willem, there was a kind of question to you also in terms of the change of patterns away from Europe and India towards Asia and China. Maybe you'd like to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And yes, happy to respond to that. So you kind of alluded to kind of the potential changes in how maybe Eastern Africa and Western Africa might be kind of different in how they are being affected by trade patterns. So what the report kind of does in general is it kind of takes 3 levels of perspective. So it looks at kind of the effects across the 10 countries. It then looks at kind of effects in groups of countries, but it also looks at effects in individual countries. And what we are indeed seeing is that, for instance, the kind of the preconditions about trading partners and kind of the extent with previous trade, for instance, with China and India, also partly determine kind of the longer term outcomes. So, for example, countries such as maybe Cabo Verde and Mauritius, which have a relatively stronger economic interdependence with the EU, are also more strongly affected kind of by the economic recovery patterns and trade patterns with the EU, whereas countries in Eastern Africa, such as Kenya and Ethiopia, are more strongly affected by kind of the shifts with India and China. So the report kind of already shows kind of how these futures might diverge. But of course, what you also talked about was kind of the option for potential changing policies. So the European Union having the kind of refocusing part of their trade towards Western Africa. Those are not really the questions that we have been able to address in this report, because it often assumes kind of a stable policy. But of course, kind of with COVID-19 and the extent of the impact that it's having, there are many questions about kind of maybe a more regional focus of many supply value chains, and also uncertainties indeed associated with kind of how trading partners might recover over time, but also how they might strategically also themselves manage their economic interdependence. So what, of course, we are arguing in the report is that African nations should manage their economic interdependence. But of course, this is never done in isolation. It will be true that also indeed European countries, and for instance also China and India, are already basically managing their economic independence. It kind of shows how important it is to strategically think about these global interconnections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willem. What I'm going to do is invite the 3 panelists who haven't had any opportunity to make some final remarks, and then we'll finish. And I'll invite Dr. Yo Dusinia first of all. Dr. Yo, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the floor again to speak. So some of the questions that have been posed. I feel like I would like to start where the last speaker has started. I feel like we should pose our question differently. Why Africa is importing things from China? Why Africa is tied in export and trade is very tied to China? Why? Because we are importing things from them. If we have, if that those products produced in Africa will not continue to rely on China production because we don't produce anything. So we should produce whatever we are seeking from China. We are importing from China. We have to substitute them. I think the only thing, and we have said it a lot about economic transformation, diversification, etc., and transforming our raw material here instead of importing raw material and importing finished products. My second reaction is about the health financing and how to improve domestic resource mobilization. I think that one of the questions was the head of state had agreed to provide 15% of the budget to health sector. I think that there are also many other commitments that have been made by head of state, including agriculture, and to each member state to allocate 10% of the agriculture. 12% of the budget to agriculture sector, 20% of the budget to education. So all this making 45% of national budget to this sector. So this is also sometimes a problem. All can some sectoral minister take some decision and ask Minister of Financing to allocate all this. But it depends to each African countries of their priorities, so that we can be able to allocate the sufficient resources to each of the sectors. But any decision that have been taken forcing countries, maybe those sectors are not relevant for them, are not the main priority for them, so we cannot improve it. We cannot really admit the target that have been set by the summit. The second aspect is about how to improve domestic resource mobilization. I have seen somebody, when I was talking about it, to improve, to tax the informal sector. We're not saying that we need to tax the informal sector today, because we know that informal sector have been heavily impacted by COVID-19. But we need to build them, we need to support them. We are not creating national domestic enterprises. That is the problem. All our domestic enterprises are in informal sector. Let's help them to become a giant, of enterprises, so that we can participate in production, so that we can be able to tax them. The second thing I think we need to explain to our citizens the benefit of tax. When any citizen pay tax, what is he expecting? What are the benefits from that when you pay tax? We need to explain that to them, and we need to show that to them. We need also to improve tax system with using technology, so that we can be more effective in tax collection. We need also to build the capacity of tax administrator. We need also to ensure also exchange of information among countries. We have been working with OECD on exchange of information on tax for tax purposes, and we have seen many countries that have been able to recover back through exchange of information among jurisdictions to recover back some taxes that have been lost through illicit financial flow. The new world that we are living, digital economy. There are many giant digital enterprises operating in Africa, but we are not taxing them. Why should we not use the opportunity to tax them? And that discussion is also going on with OECD level, at OECD level. In fact, Africa is making a strong position on that to be able to ensure that we tax digital economy in the continent.
Thank you very much, Dr.
To also use national saving.
Yeah. I'm sorry, we're running out of time here.
Using national saving to.
Yeah. Go ahead. Just finish your point, and then we'll move on to the next panelist. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that we need to use also national saving. This is also heavy here. We are not using national saving productive areas, so we need to really mobilize national saving to finance productive capacity in the continent to be able to produce.
Very valuable, important point. Professor Bernadette, please, your final reflections on the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Talking about poverty, you will find the greatest number in the service sector. So if I should summarize in terms of a shorter term policy, we should think about securing labor-intensive services, maybe professional fees in order, to increase, to support for production and trade in the services. These people, we have seen so many. I have an example around me. I have even my son who was working in the service sector. And with COVID, he could not even make it an adult, having to rely on me to survive. That's one we should think about twice, how we should do that. Start by saving the existing job in a sector like the service, like the services, in order, in the shorter term to reduce the number of poor. In the longer term, I said it and I'm underscoring that we should think about actioning the industrial policy, think about industrialization. And for that, I was talking about combining diversification, production diversification and export diversification in order to make it true that we have the industrialization effort, become a real one. And I'm glad that the African Development Bank made industrialization one of its major priorities. And let us hope that even under COVID, under the pandemic, this strategy will not be set aside, but contrary, it will be action and put at work. So we are inviting African government to take it seriously. I got one question of, I read one of the question and wanting to know what should be done and who should do it. And I said that it could not be government alone. We should think about a strong partnership. Even the private sector should be brought into the solution. But provided the private sector has been stabilized, because the sector has been hardly hit by the pandemic. So these are the points that I wanted to underscore by closing my intervention. Thank you.
Thank
Chair.
you very much, Professor Bernadette. And I'm finally turning to Deputy Minister Dr. Patricia Laverly for your final reflections.
Thank you very much. I'm going to add my voice to increasing domestic revenue mobilization. What we are currently doing is twofold. First, we're formulating a medium-term domestic revenue mobilization strategy. But while we're doing that, we've also launched a national campaign to increase our voluntary tax compliance rate. We've launched a national campaign sensitizing all citizens in Sierra Leone that they must pay their taxes so we can pay for their healthcare. Pay your taxes to pay for your healthcare. Third, we're actually working on a national health insurance scheme in the country. And that, I think it's about to go to cabinet shortly, and it would hopefully get rolled out next year. A national health insurance scheme. Now, for the private sector, what's currently happening in Africa is, in terms of our response to shocks and what we need to do to build our resilience, we're still a long way to go with our local insurance and international insurance, access to international insurance markets, until we develop our local insurance industries to respond, to provide support to our micro enterprises, our businesses, and so on. Would we begin to seriously talk about domestically responding to shocks and building the resilience that our economies need in Africa. So those are just my thoughts I thought I should add. Increasing our voluntary tax compliance rates, a national campaign, establishing national health insurance schemes across countries, and strengthening our local insurance markets, not just in Sierra Leone, but across the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Patricia, and thank you for joining us. Your insights have been actually very important, I think, to kind of broaden the discussion here and add to the richness. We're now out of time. I just want to invite Dr. Raymond Gilpin as the architect of this process, whether he wants to say any final farewell remark, and then we'll finish. Raymond.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists, speakers, and all the institutions who've collaborated with us on what I believe could be the start of a very useful conversation, looking at the COVID response from a country-specific basis across Africa. Want to take this opportunity to thank you, Alex, and Chatham House for hosting us. Also thank once again the 3 institutions that we worked with, but at the risk of omission, I must mention a number of colleagues who've really worked hard behind the scenes. Fatima Ahmed, TPC from Chatham House, El Haj Fal, and a number of others who were really instrumental in pulling this together, Michelle Mendy, JD Okeke, and encourage you to download the report and keep this conversation going. And we hope that we'll have a second round of this conversation when we'll be analyzing what has been done. Thank you so much, Alex, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, from my point of view, just I want to thank UNDP and Raymond and his team especially for partnering with us on this, and for the audience for staying the course. Not only are we have several hundred people who joined us on Zoom, but many more hundreds on Facebook Live, and to remind everybody that this was fully on the record and that it has been recorded and will be put up on the Chatham House website. So not only will Raymond and colleagues' report be available easily, but also the recording of this particular meeting. So thank you, everybody. And on behalf of the Africa program at Chatham House, I hope you'll join us again. My name is Alex Vines, Director of the Africa program, wishing you all a very good afternoon and good evening, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
Thank you very much.